You're listening to a bonus episode of The Dairy Age, featuring Teagasc's weekly Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, which is also available as a podcast.
Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to the current issue of Let's Talk Dairy. On this episode of Let's Talk Dairy, I'm joined by Catherine McAloon. Catherine is a researcher and lecturer in veterinary medicine in UCD. Catherine, I should have asked you before you started, what field is your principal area of expertise in the vet college?
Thanks a million, George. Good morning. I suppose I'm working in the section of herd health and animal husbandry. So a nice job split between clinical teaching of veterinary students working in the hospital here. We do a lot of herd health investigation on farms across the country and also some research. I suppose calves are something very close to my heart, so I'm very passionate and interested in that area.
Okay, very good. And you're in that field for a number of years at this stage. So today we've got the glamorous topic of preventing, or not so much preventing, more about dealing with scouring calves. And so where I'd like to start our conversation, Catherine, is in the whole area of the principal causes of scour in young calves.
Yeah, so I mean,
we're kind of dealing with, because the Let's Talk Dairy, it's more dairy calves.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, unfortunately, every farm has to deal with the scourge of scour. Year on year, I guess it is biased data that comes into the regional vet labs because, passive surveillance. But the number one and two pathogens it causing calf scour in Ireland would be rotavirus and cryptosporidium. I suppose if you were to split them up, the kind of main viral causes of scour are rotavirus and coronavirus. They tend to happen in calves sort of from a week to a month or, up 6 weeks of life, most commonly. But I think interestingly, cryptosporidium and also coccidiosis or blood scour, as it's known, would be the two main parasitic causes. So it's actually really interesting that crypto, which is the scourge, I suppose, of a lot of calf scour problems, is actually a parasite, and that just means that it's incredibly resistant in the environment and hard to treat and so on. Coccidiosis is the blood scar, but it sort of takes about 3 weeks to complete its life cycle. So we tend not to see that in very young calves. It's kind of, 2.5 weeks onward. And of course, there are bacterial causes. So E. coli, for example, would tend to cause calf scar, but only in very young calves and usually when, under a week old. And perhaps if there is an issue with colostrum management, that kind of thing. And then you've weird and wonderful things like salmonella, maybe a bit older, but rotavirus, crypto would be the headlines for us in Ireland.
Roto and crypto. Rota. And how does it manifest itself then? What happens when a calf has a scour? What happens to the calf?
So I guess when a calf gets, these pathogens hit the gut, they really damage the natural defense mechanisms and the natural physiological mechanisms of gut activity. So the gut is a long tube, as we know, but it's actually, the intestines, what it looks like, but within that it's highly specialized and it has these finger-like villi projections. Yeah. And basically they're the be-all and end-all of fluid and water and electrolyte absorption. So when you have crypto in there or rotavirus, they basically damage the normal function, which means that the calf can't absorb fluids and starts losing water, which is quickly followed by electrolytes. So the calf then scours this high volume watery feces and loses all the important salts, sodium, chloride, potassium, and so on. So then you end up with a very sick, dehydrated calf. So it's that kind of gut wall is really where it's all happening.
And is there any research done then, Catherine, on the long-term effects of a serious scour incident in the calf? Do we know in terms of how they perform afterwards, or is there a long-term carryover thing there?
Yeah, so I suppose the traditional view would have been that a calf that gets, an episode of scour can get over it, catch up, and doesn't suffer the long-term weight gain, consequences that maybe you would see in a calf with pneumonia, which would be much more likely to have a long-term downstream lifetime effect. Yeah. More recent research has actually shown that crypto, in fact, particularly in beef calves, I think there was a study there very recently that's shown that a significant episode of crypto could in fact have more of a long-term impact than we originally thought. So I guess it really depends how sick they are and for how long, but it's certainly not without its consequences.
Yeah, I have a feeling in the back of my head. It was a colleague of mine who's involved heavily in contract rearing of heifers, said that sick heifers were always about 30 kilos behind at breeding as a rough rule of thumb. It's quite significant.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Never mind the scourge of dealing with it at the time.
The hassle and hardship people face is unbelievable. So we just move on then. I suppose the core of what we're trying to cover here today is in the whole area of treatment then of the calves.
Yeah.
So I have a calf with scour. I just noticed it this morning. He's off his milk a bit and looking a bit dehydrated. What am I going to do?
So I guess the signs of dehydration are pretty obvious. The kind of, slightly sunken eye and so on, obviously progressing to the more severe cases where the eye is back in the head and calf, is wobbly and weak.
Yeah.
So I guess the first thing is those mild cases, will really benefit from oral fluid therapy. So regardless of the cause of scour, whether it's crypto or rotavirus or whatever, the treatment approach is largely the same. And the mainstay of treatment is trying to replace the fluid and electrolytes that are lost in this high volume scour. So that really revolves around trying to get in electrolytes in water, so as maybe extra feeds during the day. So ideally that if they're having their milk feed, and they should be offered their milk because it absolutely does not worsen scour and in fact has been shown to speed up recovery. If they're fit to drink their milk, that is, I wouldn't go stomach tubing it, but if they're fit to drink it, they should get it morning and evening. And the electrolytes should be offered separately as a separate feed entirely. So maybe at lunchtime and maybe before bed or whatever way it suits logistically. But the idea about those electrolytes or oral fluid replacement therapy, as it's called, is about getting in extra fluid. So although lots of the products claim that they can be given in milk, that largely defeats the purpose. So they should be given in water as an extra feed, completely separate to the milk feed. I suppose that's really the backbone of treatment, is trying to get those fluid in. So even if the calf is only kind of mildly affected, they will certainly benefit from an oral rehydration therapy. To a more severely affected calf, obviously, as long as they're up and about and able to take that electrolyte and fluid. So you can give it in a bucket, in a feeder, whatever way. If they won't drink it, of course, you can stomach tube it, because it's fine to stomach tube electrolytes. The same, of course, is not true for milk as those calves get older. As well as electrolytes, which, as I said, is definitely the backbone. Ideally, we would try and remove the calf if it's only one or two, and have some kind of hospital or isolation facility. And I know that can be highly impractical in an outbreak scenario, but if we do get in time, that can make a difference, because the infectious dose is extremely low, when a calf is scouring, they're spewing out millions of eggs and so on, if it was crypto, for example, and that is enough to set up infection in very many calves. So you'll ramp up the infection very quickly in the shed with one or two scouring calves. So if we can remove them and isolate them where practical, that's a sensible thing to do. The mainstay of their treatment is the oral fluids, and continuing to offer milk if they want to drink it. And then, of course, depending on what you have, there are other treatments.
See, medication on top of that as well, for depending on the bacteria that's caused. How do you know which, or bacteria or parasite, how do you know which is causing the problem? How do you determine that?
So you certainly can't tell by looking at it. Ultimately you need a sample, and you need to know what you're dealing with, because, if you end up with, 4 or 5 calves scouring, you really want to know what's in there. Yeah. If it was crypto, for example, there are things, it's a zoonotic pathogen, which means it can infect humans. And in that scenario, we'd want to know if young calves are, if they had it, that, the children or maybe immunocompromised people wouldn't be dealing with those calves, because they could catch the infection themselves. So things like that, you really want to know. And also for things like for crypto, there might be drugs like Halocure or Parafor or something ancillary to the fluid treatment that you might give, that you would certainly not dream of giving if it wasn't crypto. Additionally, for blood scar, again, they'd have their own treatments, so in addition to the fluids. So really getting a sample to your vet. They have rapid test kits, so they can usually turn them around very quickly, or perhaps it needs to go to the lab. But trying to get a handle on what's in there is sensible, because then that will direct if further treatment is needed. Yeah,
just giving the calf a jab of antibiotics when you see it's sick is not necessarily the right first step, really. Sure, it's not.
No, and in actual fact, the large majority of, as I mentioned, rotavirus and cryptosporidium are not bacterial in origin, and
Exactly.
those calves will not benefit from antibiotics. So,
No.
really, they shouldn't be getting them. The vast majority of mild to moderate cases of scar that are still up and able to drink their milk, and you're able to manage them, don't need antibiotics at all. But that being said, obviously the very sick ones most certainly do, and we shouldn't be afraid to give them. The calf that's down or has maybe well off its feed for a couple of days, has a fever. Certainly, if there's any blood in the dung or anything like that, those calves do need antibiotics. So and should get it, and you should speak to your vet about an appropriate drug for that and an approach to treatment on your farm.
Yeah.
So if needed, give it to them, but the vast majority, I suppose, don't.
Exactly. Now, if we just move on then to the third and final part of the whole conversation we want to have here, tell us a bit about prevention then. I mean, prevention is better than cure, as they say. So where do you start from a prevention perspective?
Yeah, so I think although sometimes this can sound very abstract, I guess the devil really is in the detail when it comes down to prevention of calf diarrhea. And regardless of the type of scar that you have on the farm, the principles of an infectious disease control in calves is largely, broadly similar. So it focuses on two pillars. One is getting the calf to be as absolutely immune as you possibly can, which really is about the colostrum picture. So, and I would go further in that it is not just about the 1, 2, 3, getting them enough colostrum of good quality and quickly, that, it's about how that colostrum is, if it's hygienically harvested and stored properly and so on, can really make a difference to the bang for the buck that the calf gets out of it. So optimizing colostrum at all costs, because if you have calves dying of scar, there's often, two reasons. There's often more than one pathogen involved, but also they're often, maybe on the edge of colostrum management. And so good colostrum and everything we can do to make marginal improvements in that is probably the first thing we can do. In terms of their resistance, feeding them well. So feeding them enough milk so that they can grow and keep warm and fight infection so if we're feeding calves on a very marginal feed rate of 10% of body weight or something like that, that's just not enough for them to fight infection. So, underfed calves and cold stress calves become sick calves. So good colostrum management and feeding them on a proper plane of nutrition, a minimum 15% of body weight, keeping them warm and good housing, things like that is sort of the first half. And then the second half or the other pillar that I mentioned would be trying to reduce the amount of infection they become exposed to and infection pressure. And that's really all about hygiene. So the calving pen, the beds, the colostrum feeding equipment, the calf feeding equipment, the calf pens, things like, are the calf pens able to be kept dry, things like that. And
it's kind of hard to keep a calf pen dry and clean at the same time, because usually the teams will power hose it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, and we really don't want to do that in season, particularly if there's calves in situ in the shed, because we're just going to add a whole more moisture and possibly aerosolize infection and things like that. So there's a couple of things around the hygiene piece that I would also mention. That, crypto, for example, because it is a parasite with a, double-walled outer shell on the eggs, incredibly can hang around from 1 year to the next. So, and most farm disinfectants don't actually, most, standard farm grade disinfectant have no efficacy at all on crypto or cocci because they're parasites. So we really need to be using specialized disinfectants on that very important day where the calf sheds are cleaned, steam cleaning, giving them a rest between calving seasons if you've, or between, a batch of calves, if possible. Within the season, then it's about trying to come up with kind of bespoke, sensible solutions to keep it dry. We're probably not going to be going in with a power hose, but trying to keep it as clean as we can. But we can use some of those disinfectants, for example, that are active against crypto in a foot dip, even, even something like that might help.
Make a difference, yeah. I suppose one of the standouts for me over the last couple of years working on the calf care events with you is the number of people who think that when a calf is sick, you take it off milk, and the rows that we get with older farming people about that particular area. I remember one or two stand-up rows in the past.
Yes, I think I might have been the target of some of those rows.
You might have been, yeah.
Pastures, but yeah.
100% it's both milk and fluids they get.
Yes, because there's lots and lots of studies. There's overwhelming evidence now that shows that by taking them off milk, we actually starve the calf. And electrolytes are great at replacing electrolytes, but they
Yeah,
tend to be quite low in energy. So the
energy.
calf needs energy to fight infection. And also milk is good at recovery and aiding gut recovery and things like that. So if the calf is fit to drink it, I wouldn't force it upon it. But they should certainly be offered their normal milk feeds and should be capable of some growth. If they're only mildly affected. So
Yeah.
keep the milk to them. Certainly overwhelming evidence to say absolutely.
Okay, that's great. That's good to know. Ladies and gentlemen, if anyone has any last questions for Catherine, we'll take them now. We can put them into your chat box there, your what is the question and answer piece. If not, I suppose in summary, Catherine, a couple of things. Rotavirus and crypto seem to be the big ones.
Yeah.
With a whole heap of them, and neither of them are bacterial. So antibiotics is not going to cure either of them.
No, the antibiotic piece really is for secondary infection in a sick calf that's quite severely infected. One thing I actually forgot to mention, George, I think would be important. I suppose we're still in early January, and there might be some time if farms are considering it. Is that there is a cow vaccination, so it needs to be in sort of 3 weeks before they calve to have the desired effect at making the cholesterol antibodies against rotavirus. So, the scar vaccine in cows can be helpful, and even in farms that have crypto problems, if you can remove at least one pathogen off the playing field, or at least reduce it, control it. So the scar vaccines are very helpful in increasing cholesterol antibodies against E. coli and rotacoronavirus. So they are something to consider in the toolkit as well.
A question that came in there was about transition milk. So if we've sickish calves and they're on, say, a powder, say 750 grams of powder at 6 litres, whatever the rate you're feeding is, could we mix some transition milk or colostrum even into the milk solution that they're being fed? Would that help?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I suppose some farmers do it and do it successfully. I think the issue for me is that if you're going to feed transition milk, that's great, and feed it in that first week in life and so on. But once they move on to powder, I guess it's another dietary change. So if you've spent the money on scar vaccines, there is an effect of that. Although the colostrum antibodies are not absorbed after the first few hours, first 12 hours of life, there is a local effect in the gut of colostrum and transition milk of those antibodies. So ideally they would stay on it before their transition. If you're going to do that you do that for day 2 to 7 or whatever works for the farm. I think the issue with dilution and mixing around two feeds, it can be done, but you just want to be careful about a dietary change on top of a very upset gut, and sometimes it could make things worse. So there's no, I would say, science one, not that at least I'm aware of, that says, absolutely do this or absolutely don't. I think I'm probably not a huge fan of mixing and matching. Transition milk is great, feed it properly and first, but once they move on, I'd be trying to reduce the dietary changes if possible.
Okay, so keep them nice and steady. If the calf has a temperature with the scour, what would you do?
Well, actually, regardless of a temperature or not, lots of scouring calves, it's painful, gut contraction and so on, can really benefit from a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which of course you'll have to get from your vet, and really you would need to agree that, a treatment approach with your vet, so that, if you have that in stock, you're on farm, you're going to be able to use it. So if a calf has a fever, you need to treat the fever with a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. But I would go a step further, that lots of, calves that are affected by scour, even in the absence of fever, would probably benefit from a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, as long as they're drinking. If they're off the suck completely, then that might not be true.
An anti-inflammatory.
An anti-inflammatory. Well, you would need to correct the fluid. So if they're completely off the suck, they're going to need veterinary intervention. If they're not taken for multiple feeds a day, for example, like that calf, you're going to struggle to keep it hydrated with oral fluids, and that's likely to a calf that's going to go downhill and maybe need a drip. And if that's the case, then certainly, but I wouldn't be bandying around non-steroidal anti-inflammatory unless it's a sick calf that needs it. But non-steroidals or anti-inflammatory drugs, they have a benefit, certainly. Even if the calf isn't showing fever, but they must get it if they have a fever.
Okay, very good. So you just answered your second question, Catherine, there. So there's another question in here. Some farms use calf or sheep slats without bedding in the young calf pens, in the belief that bedding holds and spreads scour. Any ideas or thoughts on this practice, Catherine?
So I suppose I've had problems with individual pens, cryptorite bricks, things like wooden slats that are, hang around in an individual pen for that calf and from year on year, and the wood is porous. And it's a difficult method to deal with to properly clean those calf pens with those slats. So bedding is the same as dry cows. It doesn't matter as long as it's how the bedding is managed as opposed to the bedding itself per se. So if you can keep plenty of dry straw to them, and keep them dry and clean and so on, then it's not necessarily the issue. Of course, is how you manage it. So I wouldn't say that it's a benefit of one over the other, because slats can be difficult, particularly wood that's porous and difficult to clean. So the bedding itself isn't necessarily the issue if you can keep, but of course, obviously, if you have a scouring calf on a straw bed, it's going to be very difficult to keep it dry and clean and not ramp up the infection unless you can pull the calf away, from its cohorts or whatever. So I have no issue with bedding, but it's the management of it really is the key for management of crypto and things like that.
You'd nearly imagine you'd be better on a bed in a way, Catherine, because it'll keep them a bit warmer.
Yes, so that's, I suppose, a huge thing in calves. So I've alluded kind of briefly there to cold stress, but under 3 weeks, 4 weeks of age, a calf, under 15 degrees, basically. So pretty much every day in spring in Ireland needs to use energy to keep warm. So that's feed energy that they're using to keep themselves alive, to grow, to run an immune system, but also to keep themselves warm. So they become cold stressed very quickly. So if you have a calf lying on a wet bed, so on a wet bed of straw, on concrete or slats or something like that, they're losing heat energy to the floor. So they're into the cold, and that becomes your cold stress calf, and they find it harder to fight infection. And certainly temperature control in that young calf is something that we'd see in an outbreak scenario, that particularly in calves under 3 weeks old. So really the straw is absolutely necessary to keep them warm, keep them cozy, as long as we can manage it correctly.
Yeah. To me, and to be straight about it, I'd say you'd be looking at deep beds of straw for sick calves.
Absolutely.
Better for well calves. That'd be my call on it anyway. I know there's a bit of hassle, but better with them.
Better with them for welfare and everything else, but particularly from the keeping warm piece, because a cold stress calf gets sick. So if it's lying on a wet bed or a concrete floor or something like that, it's losing heat energy. And
a scoury calf with stuff running through it is not going to be a warm calf.
No, and some of those will benefit from the hospital pen, maybe with an infrared lamp and so on, if we have it. But of course, practicalities in spring. If one calf, maybe not so bad. If it becomes 10, it's more difficult.
Ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, we're going to conclude there. I thank Catherine for her contribution. I find Catherine an absolute mine of information on calves and calf rearing, and she's 99% of the time she's right as well. It's a hard thing for me to say about anyone, but anyway, that's the truth.
Thanks, George.
Oh, hang on, Catherine. One more question. This is the last question, I promise you. Calf coats. Now, we had that one last week now, Ned, in fairness. Calf coats is the question.
Yeah, so again, they're, hugely positive advent to the calf rearing in that they really help tackle that cold stress piece. Yeah. So in that calf under 3 or 4 weeks of age that's using feed energy to keep warm, that's where that really comes in. So it really helps the calf to maintain body temperature, which means it's not a cold stress calf and so on. So yes, they absolutely work. I'm a big fan of them.
Yeah, and I covered it. We covered it last week, Ned, as well. So I think they're the equivalent of 10 or 15 degrees of warmth anyway. So for young calves, for sick calves, they're a right help.
Definitely, yeah.
That or a red lamp, Catherine.
Yeah, no, definitely. Just they need to be, they can also be a vehicle. So if they're on a sick calf who's scouring and things like that, they'll have to be washed, obviously.
Yeah.
But
yeah, don't tell anyone in the household you're using the wash. We'll leave it at that. And thanks very much, Catherine, and the very best of luck.
That's all for this week's bonus episode from the Let's Talk Dairy webinar series, and don't forget to look out for more bonus episodes each week. I'll be back with the usual Dairy Age podcast on Monday, so do listen in then. I'm Stuart Childs, and thanks for listening.